Hi there everybody, greetings and welcome to this new set of topic. Today we are the first group and we will be talking about a model of communicative competence developed by Michael Canale and Meryl Swain. So these are the guide questions that we are going to answer for this lesson. What is a communicative competence? What are the areas of communicative competence? What are the difference between communicative competence and performance? And what is the relevance of the model of communicative competence in language testing and assessment? So before we begin the lecture proper, let me give you the executive summary or the overall summary of the presentation today. So we will be talking about the communicative competence. So communicative competence, this is the knowledge of a person about the language. This has three areas, which are the grammatical competence, the social linguistic knowledge, and the strategic competence of a person. Now, grammatical competence is the knowledge of a person about the grammar rules, and social linguistic knowledge is the knowledge of a person in applying the language in adherence to the norms of the society, including the culture. And the third is the strategic competence. This is the ability of a person to manage certain circumstances along the communication process. So it's the ability of a person to strategize in the communication to deal with factors that blunders the continuous and successful flow of communication. And we'll also be differentiating competence and performance. So basically competence is the knowledge of a person about the language, and the performance is the actual communication. These are the utterances or the actual speaking. And lastly, we will be talking about the relevance of this model in the language testing and assessment. Now let's dig deeper into the Canale and Swain communicative competence model. Canale and Swain are applied linguists, and they were the ones who developed this first and most influential model. This is very useful and very effective for teaching second language. In terms of language testing and assessment, this model is very important because it makes your measurement of communication skills more valid and more reliable. So that is the relevance of this model in this subject. So back in the day when they are still formulating this model, they reviewed different and various authors about how they define communicative competence so far. And then they argued that communicative competence refers to the interaction between grammatical competence and social linguistic competence. So it's about the grammar and the social linguistic competence of a person. Now when we say grammatical competence, it pertains to the knowledge of a person to the rules of grammar, and social linguistic knowledge or competence, this is the knowledge of the rules of language use. So according to Canale and Swain, these are the major variables of communicative competence that must be considered in assessing or testing the language proficiency or the performance of the learner or the person, the one who is using the language. Now, to make things more clear, there is a need for us to define the difference between the communicative competence and communicative performance. So communicative competence, these are the system rules that a person has mastered so that he or she can be able to produce and understand infinite number of sentences and be able to recognize grammatical errors or mistakes. Now on the other hand, performance, this is the actual communication. So these are the exact utterances of a person in the actual communication. Now there are three key areas that we need to know about communicative competence. These are your grammatical competence, your social linguistic knowledge, and your strategic competence. Let's get into it one by one. So the first most important key element in communicative competence is the grammatical competence of a person. This pertains to the knowledge of the person to the grammar rules. So for example, you will see how well the person could apply subject-verb agreement. Is the person able to apply proper usage of commas, apostrophes, and other related things? Can he or she combine two or more clauses together perfectly? Can he or she produce grammatically correct sentences? So these are the elements that you should consider in establishing tests for language or assessment for language. Another knowledge that is included in grammatical competence is in the lexis. So it pertains to the choice of words or the choice of vocabulary of a person. So can he or she recognize words that are not part, and which words are part of the language? So these are the lexis. So it also includes the knowledge of morphology, the ability of the person to use affixation, the prefix, the suffix, including the inflections, so the inflecting of words, when to use the ing form and the ed form and the s form of verb. So these are part of the morphology, which reflects to the general grammatical competence or accuracy of a person. We also have the knowledge of syntax, so the ability of the person in forming words or arranging words within the sentence. That's very important. Also the semantics. Can the person recognize identical sentences with different meanings? For example, ambiguous sentences. Like for example, let me speak in Bisaya kanang ingon kaugan ng mutuman. So mutuman in Bisaya language have two different meanings. It is both the positive and the negative meaning. Mutuman sa iyang gusto. So mutuman yung sa iyang gusto. So it's the different connotation from mutuman, which is to obey. So mutuman sa sugo. So it's quite ambiguous. But if the person is communicatively competent, has this communicative competence, he or she could be able to identify the semantic ambiguity. So this is part of the competence of an individual, which has to be considered in measuring the overall performance of that person. It also includes the knowledge of phonology. How well can the person apply the sound system of that language, the phonemes? The second aspect that has to be considered in designing a test or in assessing the language of the person is the social-linguistic competence. It pertains to the knowledge of socio-cultural norms. Like, for example, when do you say sorry? When do you say please? When do you say thank you? So these are the norms in the society that has to be considered in using the language in context. Now, the third component of this communicative competence is the strategic competence. It pertains to the knowledge about how the person can overcome problems, because along the communication process, it's inevitable that there are certain problems that we encounter. So how well the person can manage it. So your strategy in overcoming these problems, these factors that blunders successful communication process. Some of the people's strategies in communicating is the topic switch. Whenever they face problem along the communication, they suddenly divert the topic. They switch the topic into something else because they faced problems about the previous topic, so they switch into the other one. So it's a strategy. Other person also use repair, for example, or self-correction when they commit mistake in their communication, in their message, for example, they repair it. They have self-correction. So how well the person can strategize in using the language whenever there are problems. This is very important in considering language testing and assessment. Now, the second aspect of this model is the actual communication or the communicative performance. But this will be discussed by Johaira Alo, to be followed after this. So I will be giving now the screen to her. Bye. Thank you so much.
Good day everyone, I am Johaira Alo, and as a continuation to the report of Mr. Amarillo, I'm going to discuss the actual communication, which is the second component of Canale and Swain's model. The actual communication is the demonstration of knowledge in actual language performance. It is about how we as a language user can apply the language in actual use. It is also the same of performance, which means our actual use in language. According to Chomsky, and linguistic performance is a concrete way people talk in reality. Moreover, performance is the study of sentences themselves of the actual use of the language in real life situation. Despite of having perfect understanding of the correct forms, the speaker can still produce incorrect forms because performance occurs in real situation, and our mind is limited, and we make changes to our intended sentences as we speak. The distinction between competence and performance. Performance as the production of actual utterance. Competence as an idealized capacity that is located as a function and psychological. In short, competence involves knowing the language. For instance, the knowledge of grammatical rules and the knowledge of social linguistical rules, and etc. And performance involves doing something with the language. For instance, a native speaker of English and utter the following: "We swam in the ocean this weekend." So is this error due to the performance or competence? So the answer is performance that has failed, or that has an error. That has an error. The speaker unintentionally uttered the word swimmed, and the fact that a non-proficient speaker of English may not know that the past tense of swim is swam and say swimmed consistently. So therefore, it is the performance that has failed. Speech event. According to Haim, speech events are the activities that governed by rules or norms for the use of speech. Canale and Swain outline Haim's notion of speech event in terms of participant. Participant answer the question of who the act addressed to. For example, the way you act to your parents, your family, or friends, and etc. Settings answer the question when, where, time, and place. For example, market, guest room, and etc. Form, topic, purpose, case, simply the mood, the manner, and tone. It can be joyful, sad, formal, informal, etc. Channel, code, norms answer the question how participants supposed to act. The react here is the norms of interaction, and act is the norm of interpretation. And genre is the categorized type of the event. For example, the lectures, poems, and novels. The speech event is said to be the basis for understanding the rules of language use. The speech event is concern of situation in a specific situation. For example, a lecture on English language at university. So in the lecture at university, the participants is the teacher and the students, and the settings is the classroom. The K is the formal, and norms is the educational, and the genre is the lecture, presented as lecture. The seminal model of communication is relevant to language testing for several reasons. First is the distinction between communicative competence and actual performance means that tests should contain tasks that require actual performance as well as tasks or item types that measure knowledge. It is the task item allows the task taker to demonstrate their knowledge in action. Second is communicative competence was viewed as knowledge. Discrete point tests were seen as useful for some purposes. And lastly, the model, especially if it were more fine-grained, could be used to develop criteria for the evaluation of language performance at different levels of proficiency. That's all. Thank you.
Despite the simplicity of the model of Canale and Swain, this model has dominated the fields of second and foreign language acquisition and language testing for more than a decade. It's difficult to assess communicative ability. Teachers may use to assess their students' communicative ability through the use of these examples. Number 1, role play for speaking. Number 2, information gap. The learners have to negotiate in order to get the missing information. Number 3, letters for writing. and the learners may be asked to write and note-taking. It involved in a listening activity which they have to take notes. The language testing examples gives the students opportunity for thorough and meaningful rehearsal of the language which they will need for effective communication.
As a continuation to Pressel's report, so Swain and Canale's model of communicative competence is a synthesis of an underlying system of knowledge and skill needed for communication. In their concept of communicative competence, they defined what knowledge is and in what linguistic field it represents. Knowledge refers to the conscious or unconscious knowledge of an individual about language and about other aspects of language use. So the three types of knowledge. First is the knowledge of underlying grammatical principles. Second is the knowledge of how to use language in a social context in order to fulfill communicative functions. And the third one is the knowledge of how to combine utterances and communicative functions with respect to discourse and principles. So in addition, their concept of skills refers to how an individual can use the knowledge in actual communication. According to Canale, skill requires a further distinction between underlying capacity and its manifestation in real communication, that is to say, in performance, and the ability to function in a truly communicative setting, that is, in a dynamic exchange in which linguistic competence must adapt itself to the total informational input, both linguistic and paralinguistic, of one or more interlocutors. The nature of communicative competence is not static, but dynamic. It is more interpersonal than intrapersonal, and relative rather than absolute. For example, in a school setting wherein a teacher must be competent enough in delivering the lessons so that the learners will be able to absorb them. So communicative language teaching involves developing language proficiency through interactions embedded in meaningful contexts. This approach to teaching provides authentic opportunities for learning that go beyond repetition and memorization of grammatical patterns in isolation. A central concept of communicative approach to language teaching is communicative competence, the learner's ability to understand and use language appropriately to communicate in authentic rather than simulated social and school environments. So here are the 4 principles of communicative competence in language teaching. First is a communicative approach must be based on and respond to the learner's communicative needs. The second, language learners must have the opportunity to take part in meaningful communicative interaction with highly competent speakers of the language to respond to genuine communicative needs in realistic second language situations. Third, particularly at the early stages of second language learning, optimal use must be made of those aspects of communicative competence that the learner has developed through acquisition and use of the native language and that are common to those communication skills required in the second language. Fourth, and the last one, the primary objective of a communication-oriented second language program must be to provide the learner with the information, practice, and much of the experience needed to meet their communicative needs in the second language.